Hello, and thank you for joining this live Talos update on the 24th of August, which is also Independence Day of Ukraine. This is the day when Ukraine's parliament vowed to separate from the Soviet Republic in 1991, and this day has been commemorated on the 24th of August every year since. It is also now 6 months since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia began. Now, Ukrainian infrastructure has largely stayed operational and in most cases has exceeded expectations. This seems to have baffled most pundits, but for those who have been working in Ukraine for many years now, it's no surprise. Ukrainians have worked tirelessly over the years to ready themselves for this eventuality. So with that in mind, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper on our time in Ukraine, what we found when we got there, and how we've witnessed the Ukrainian people transform their cybersecurity capabilities while seemingly being constantly attacked by a cyber world power. So to do that, it is a pleasure to welcome 3 colleagues from Cisco Talos to join me for this discussion. Firstly, we have Dima Kortsovin, a senior threat intelligence researcher who is part of our Ukraine team and will talk about his experience on the ground in the region. We also have JJ Cummings, National Intelligence Principal, and Ashley Benge, Strategic Intelligence Lead, both of whom are a key part of our defense of Ukrainian infrastructure and have also orchestrated and managed our 24/7 threat hunting units. We also wanted to touch on how the changes that the people in Ukraine made years ago are paying dividends now during the war. And we also wanted to update you on the types of cyber threats that we are observing. So if you have any questions for our panel, do add them in the comments and we will do our very best to answer as many of those as possible. So before we get to that, today is Independence Day of Ukraine. So Dima, I want to ask you first of all, what does this day mean for you? Welcome to the panel.
Greetings, everyone. So strive not to be a success, but rather to be of value. The words that Einstein once said. Independence is not an extra day off, but a value that should be used for the benefit of every citizen of our country. Independence is the way independence lives in every person. If we are independent, it means that we are free. That is, we live and not exist. The same goes for the state. Independence of the state is when we have the possibility to develop the state as we want and not as we are told. When we have a real own history and not a twisted one. When we speak our native Ukrainian language and not a hostile language. And now there is a war. When there is a war in Ukraine, on the ground of Ukraine, the most important task of our people is to preserve our Ukrainian independence so that we, our children, grandchildren, and all future generations of Ukrainians could live and build our state based on national traditions and core democratic values. Independence is primarily a way, not a condition. I believe that we will overcome all the difficulties on this way.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that with us, Dima. So for our audience who are watching us, it is 6 months since the invasion began. And I was wondering, Ashley, could you recap for our audience the major timeline and the major incidents from when the invasion began?
Yeah, something, if you are not familiar with the history of this conflict, something our audience may not know is that this has actually been going on for quite a long time, many years before this most recent invasion. And so if you take a look, this timeline with NotPetya, again, targeting critical infrastructure in Ukraine. And then most recently in 2022 is when we saw this invasion actually on the ground, where, again, Russia was invading Ukraine. And so at this point, given the heightened level of activity, we went ahead and founded our task force Slava Ukraini, in order to sort of assist these critical infrastructure defenders in the Ukraine, because we've seen such a barrage of attacks even prior to the most recent invasion. So since then, we've seen a number of other supply chain attacks. We'll discuss these later on in the live stream. But really, if you're not familiar with the history of this region and this conflict, this has been going on for quite a long time, even years before this most recent invasion. And so as a result of that, Talos has actually been in region for about 6 years, since 2016, to support these efforts. And in 2022 has really strengthened our support with our 24/7 hunting operations.
Great. Thanks, Ashley. We lost a little bit of sound early on in the timeline, but that's okay, because we are going to start with our discussion around 2015, one of the first major attacks in Ukraine that drew international attention, which was the dark energy attack, which you talked about. So JJ, would you mind just recapping that a little bit, and then talk about what we found in Ukraine when we began working with them closely from a defensive and an architecture perspective?
Yeah, certainly. So as Ashley had mentioned, we started working with Ukraine roughly 6 years ago now, just after the Black Energy 2 attacks that occurred in 2015. We did provide some assistance and some research efforts, albeit remotely, in terms of the 2015 attacks of Black Energy. And then certainly in Destroyer, when that occurred in 2016, we were in country providing assistance directly. NotPetya 2017 and numerous events since then. I will say that one of the reasons we chose to go into Ukraine, frankly, and I wouldn't have said this ago. A number of people on this panel have already heard me say this a few times, but I probably would not have said this 7 months ago. But since the events over the last 6 months and the invasion of Russia into Ukraine on the 24th of February of this year, I'm happy to say, or I'm not happy to say, but we certainly went with the intent to, our primary intent was to help the Ukrainian people. Our secondary intent was to better understand the Russian adversary, frankly, right? And that's, from a strategic perspective, Russia has always picked on Ukraine. They are always in the target, right? Or in the sights, I should say, being targeted by Russia, unfortunately. Ever since Ukraine left Russia, left the Soviet Republic in 91, it's been attack after attack. Both kinetic, not necessarily large scale all the time, as well as cyber attack. And it happens repeatedly. So it only makes sense, first and foremost, to help a sovereign nation that is fighting for its independence. And it only serves also to help the greater good, to better understand the big bully that they're fighting all the time, right? So kind of as a result of that, we have taken away a lot in terms of knowledge of both the adversary and also of defensive capabilities and thoughts and ideologies. The Ukrainian people are a very resilient people, right? And I think, certainly I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that later. But we've seen a lot of crazy things happen from a good and a bad perspective, right? We've seen the amazing resiliency and strength of the Ukrainian people that they have developed over the years because they have been bullied so much, right? And that's kind of how it happens. You either step up to your bully and you learn from what the bully is doing to you, and you adapt. And ultimately you overcome. And that is certainly what Ukraine has done to date, right? is stand up to, and by almost all accounts, do a much better job than was initially anticipated. And again, I think I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But I think that pretty much covers, from that perspective, what we've seen, and kind of a brief touch on the history as well.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And that's definitely one of the main reasons why we wanted to do this event, is that we wanted to demonstrate and talk about the resiliency of the Ukrainian people. And, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's certainly baffled some people as to, why that they're able to, stand up. But for us, it's of no surprise. I'm wondering, JJ, if you just talk a little bit more about going back to our kind of early days, working closely in partnership. What are some of the recommendations that we made at the time, and how were they received, and how were they implemented?
Yeah, certainly. So I think, early on when we first went to Ukraine, around 6 years ago now, they had started to develop more resiliency kind of on their own already, again, just as a result of having to respond to Russia all the time. There were certainly a few places where we recommended additional capabilities and protections and visibility, right? In terms of things like endpoint visibility, in terms of collecting as much data as you can possibly collect for the and I would say this not just about Ukraine. I would say this just to general government corporation out there. But in the event that, or I should say, when an event occurs, the more information and data that you have to be able to forensically examine, the more you're going to be able to understand about what occurred, and then develop defensive mechanisms, right, to put in place to keep that from occurring again in the future. I'd love to say, from a kind of a selfish perspective, I'd love to say, oh, we went in and we told them all of these amazing things and they implemented them. But if I'm being honest, in a lot of cases, they were doing a pretty good job. And again, that's due in large part to being picked on all the time by Russia, right? So, Russia almost was its own worst enemy in that way, I guess, as I think about that in kind of a funny light. Certainly, continuing to put more defensive measures in place that are measured and well planned out defensive measures, not just things to check boxes, which is a thing that they largely did in Ukraine, right? They weren't checking boxes, I want to be clear. They were largely putting things in place for the actual purpose they were intended, and not just checking boxes, right? Understanding what a tool did, what its purpose was, and how it actually solved a need for them. Kind of a second piece that they're doing a lot are cultivating and developing security personnel. And that's a thing that we kind of also, helped try to push, was the, kind of the thought of having these really sharp threat analysts be able to understand and interpret the data that they were actually looking at, and then ultimately be able to take steps defensively, to take care of their nation, yeah. Frankly.
I think, and Dima, I'd like to get your perspective on that as well. I was wondering if you could talk about how Ukraine was able to improve, their overall posture, and the kind of challenges and hurdles that Ukraine had to overcome in order to get there.
So there is a fairly large number of different standards of information security methodologies for effective interaction, information exchange, etc. And government agencies, of course, applied them in their work. And after they were faced with really overwhelming flow of incoming information that required a mandatory response, all the processes were organically left to the best of them, and everything that in any way slow down the response was optimized. Speaking of obstacles or hurdles in very simple words, I will say that everyone was well aware of the seriousness of cyber attacks, and as far as I know, there was no need to ask anyone to stay longer at work, not to leave tasks unfinished, etc. And everyone worked and continues to work with without sparing themselves, putting the information protection of the state of the Ukraine in the first place. And most importantly, the various governmental agencies really started working together in close working groups, not competing with each other, but really working together.
Yeah. This reminds me, I hope he won't mind me mentioning this because I know he's watching, but this reminds me of a tweet that our Director of Threat Intelligence, Matt Only, tweeted a couple of weeks ago, where he said, cybersecurity is not a technology problem, it's a human problem, and it will be solved by human beings because, well, I'll clean up the language a little bit, but humans care. It's a family show. Human beings care. And what you just said there reminded me of that, about human beings collectively coming together to get what needs to be done. Dima, if I could ask you a little bit more about this, I'd love to know, could you summarize what are the things that Ukraine has done right to help keep their systems running and operational?
So among the many things that was done right, in my opinion, coordination with partners and proper cyber threat intelligence information sharing played one of the key roles in successfully resisting cyber attacks. Effective processing and systematization of TI threat information, victim notifications, and multi-layer confirmation of problem resolutions with follow-ups for constituencies has become a winning strategy in the end. The amount of information that CRTA, Ukrainian governmental computer emergency response team, has processed and continues to process, combining all these with public information they provide is impressive. How the State Cyber Protection Center, responsible for all critical infrastructure monitoring and resilience acting, is inspiring. And last but not least, Cyber Police Department of National Police of Ukraine, different units starting from forensic unit to individual special agents, their work truly influenced.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Ashley and JJ, maybe you could come on this as well. Can you recap the Talos response to the invasion and how we responded on a global level? It's quite a big question, but could you recap for the audience what, you know, in those first few days, how Talos responded to the invasion?
Yeah, I think we were realistically, we had actually been running hot for a solid 2 months leading up to the actual invasion. We had observed a distinct increase in activity, and certainly from a kinetic perspective, we, as with the rest of the world, were very closely tracking the situation in terms of troops amassing on the border, training exercises, if you will, and all of the things that were occurring, and tying that together with other intelligence that we had, as well as direct observations. So we had started, again, a solid 2 months prior to the actual invasion, working with other organizations globally, as well as inside of Ukraine, to identify threats as early on as we were able to shut down infrastructure as aggressively as we could. Kind of all of the things that that you want to do, but doing so in a much more aggressive manner, given the increase in tempo that we had observed or were observing at the time. And then once the invasion actually occurred, we needed to spin up additional capability, right? Cisco as a whole, from Chuck down, made the decision that we were supporting Ukraine that we were certainly condemning Russian actions, and that we were going to do what we needed to do the right thing, which is a thing that we just do here at Cisco Talos, right? And occasionally we get in trouble for that, but that's a whole separate conversation. This is not one of those cases. So, it became obvious early on that we needed to create a much more structured and larger scale team. And kind of at that point, we identified kind of 3 different distinct lines of effort, so that people inside of Cisco as a whole could contribute, because there was an overwhelming response when we put out a request of, hey, we're going to do this thing. We need help doing it because it's a massive effort. And we also knew that people, frankly, just wanted to help, again, because it's the right thing to do, right? So we started kind of these 3 different lines of effort, one being kind of this OSINT effort, where basically anybody in Cisco could join a specific channel and provide open source information and intelligence that they had identified in any media source, on the dark web, any of these places, right? The idea is to just start collecting this information so that we can then take that to our actual geopolitical and linguist specialists, so that they can curate it and distill out the really useful stuff for their analysis, right? And then, of course, there's a direct monitoring piece, which I think Ashley will speak to here in just a second, where we put the call out and said, hey, any Ukrainian organization that needs help, you can have our stuff for free. And if you really need help, we'll help you monitor it. We'll help augment your personnel. We'll help highlight and flag critical things as we observe them. Because certainly you've got much more serious things to worry about from a kinetic perspective, right? Yeah. Certainly cyber impacts kinetic in a major way, or has the capability to these days, right? Everything is interconnected. We've got power stations, communications, all the different critical infrastructure sectors, if you will, that can impact a fighting force, right? And can have significant impact, certainly, on morale. But yeah, I could talk for hours about this stuff. So, and then there was kind of the other third mission that we had in terms of what we were doing, and I already talked about it a little bit, but that's kind of the geopolitical piece of it, right? And again, that larger effort was feeding down into those analysts. So it's kind of intertwined with the OSINT bit, I guess, but a little more involved, certainly. So I'll stop now. Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, just before Ashley talks, just to, for anyone who's not aware, Chuck, that JJ mentioned, is Chuck Robbins, our CEO. JJ's on first name basis. I'm not, which is probably a good thing. Yeah, so just in case anyone didn't know, that's Chuck Robbins. Ashley, could you talk about your perspective in terms of our response?
Yeah. So on that note, I think when the news broke of the invasion in February, it was a consensus throughout Cisco coming down from the top of the CEO. We want to help in any way that we can. And so we made this offering that JJ mentioned, of offering our security products for free to any Ukrainian organization that wanted to deploy those. What we found is that we had actually a tremendous uptake for that offering, particularly of what JJ mentioned, that third aspect of actually having Talos monitor those security products. And the reason we wanted to make that an offering is because those security products do a really good job of detecting a lot of kind of the day-to-day. But I think when you are involved in warfare, there's an aspect of things that are new, that are outside of the realm of what's been seen before. And so this 24/7 threat hunting operation was born out of a desire to monitor those the activity that's happening on those deployments and make sure that we are 100% giving our Ukrainian partners any help that we can. And so this was quite the task because it scaled up very, very rapidly. We weren't quite sure what the adoption of that was going to be, and then it became very much well adopted. And so to really sort of efficiently and effectively help to the best of our ability, we actually built out a structured program around this. And so we put out a call for volunteers throughout Talos. At first, we were asking mostly for people with threat hunting experience, but what we found is that we were actually able to get people with a variety of security research backgrounds from all across Talos. And we ended up with about 50 volunteers that are actively monitoring. Those hunters are working in these smaller groups that are assigned a portion of our partners. And they're really looking to become as familiar as possible with their environment so we can monitor for any deviations outside of that sort of baseline of activity. Those hunters are then able to sort of work free of any kind of obstruction. And JJ and I tag team the operations and technical aspects of making sure that these hunters can do their job. They don't have to worry about sort of any kind of like bureaucracy or reporting or the boring paperwork that goes along with making sure your bases are covered. And we've had the privilege as part of this program to really work with our Ukrainian partners directly. I would say that's been the most unique aspect for this program, but also the most worthwhile or rewarding aspect. I think in security research, as a researcher, you don't often get to work directly with your customer. And so to be able to actually work with these partners and kind of clarify that gray area that tends to come up in hunting where activity seems suspicious, but we aren't able to ask the customer necessarily, is this intentional activity or is this something you don't know is going on? And so being able to really work in that gray area, clarify with partners, monitor for any behavior that's even slightly suspicious, that's really allowed us to kind of deepen these relationships, and it's been really successful to this point. JJ mentioned we also have OSINT channels going that have pulled volunteers from across Cisco. We actually have about 750 people working in that group, and so really the volunteer effort from throughout Cisco has been amazing. That's a global operation at this point, and so it's really, this project has really sort of blown up to a size that I don't think we anticipated, but because of that volunteer effort, we're really able to contribute, I think, in what is hopefully a meaningful way.
Great, thank you. I'll probably ask you a little bit more about the threat hunting units a little later, because I think our audience and defenders across the world could take a lot of best practice advice from the things that you've discovered and the challenges that you've overcome with those units. So we'll come back to that in a second. Dima, I'd like to ask you, on a human level, what are the things that you would like people to know about what has happened and what is still happening in Ukraine?
So since the war has not yet ended in victory for Ukraine, the same applies to the war in cyberspace. Cyber warfare is ongoing, and everyone needs to be well prepared to react to threats, to be careful and cautious. Try to rely only on official sources. Avoid any anonymously published information. Do not help spread the rumors. Speaking about information security, I highly recommend to follow official recommendations of Cyber Police and State Special Communications Service of Ukraine. They publish a lot of important and useful information that will help you to protect yourself. Don't forget to check the Talos blog, as we work very, very tightly with mentioned agencies and other partners, protecting more than 30 critical infrastructure objects in Ukraine.
Yeah, definitely. Talosintelligence.com is a single source of truth of everything that we are adding about what we know about the cybersecurity activities in Ukraine. So if you don't subscribe to that already, please do check that out. Same question actually for Ashley and JJ on the human side of things. What would you like our audience to know, be aware of about specifically the Ukrainian response? Might kind of talk about the cybersecurity aspect in a little bit, but I want to talk about the human side of things first.
Sure, I can start with this. I think from our perspective, one of the biggest challenges throughout this process is that as the war has drawn on, this is a volunteer effort. This is something that our folks are choosing to do throughout Cisco and Talos, in addition to their regular job responsibilities. And I think that managing burnout as we continue this effort has really become important. And so this is a live program. This is something that we're evolving as it goes. And we have really been able to kind of watch that and act in such a way that we're able to change the structure of the program to make sure that we can continue to sustain our effort instead of burning our folks out early. And so some of the changes we've made include some automation. And so we've developed automation to kind of give our hunters leads to go off of. And that has helped. We also, encourage our folks as much as possible. If you need time away, because this is a very critical thing, oftentimes we're working weird hours. It's time sensitive work. And so there can be this sense of urgency, and that can be very tiring. And so anytime someone feels that they need to step away, we rotate people in and out. It's totally okay to take breaks. And I think in the beginning, this is something that especially JJ and myself found really difficult, because this is something, to quote again, Matt Olney, this is something that I think many feel is worth burning out over. But even if you do feel that way, burning out does not allow you to continue to sustain your efforts. And so that's sort of a one and done thing, where if you grind yourself to the point of no return, then you can't continue to help, especially as this continues to draw on for months and months. And we don't really know when the end point will be. And so we really restructured the program as much as we can to continue to sustain that effort. And I think it's been a really good lesson in managing, the people that are involved from the volunteer side, making sure that they're taken care of as much as possible.
Definitely. JJ, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, sure. I think, I think Ashley hit on the major points. This is a very fluid program for us, and it's something that we haven't traditionally done, right? We have a lot of expertise, people who are really good at threat hunting, people who are really good at, finding the weird thing using magic math that I don't and never will understand. People who are really good at understanding and know the geopolitics of the region. But we've never conducted a direct, intense, and focused effort like this across all of Talos. And certainly the stakes have never been the same, right? And I think that there is a lot of emotional taxation kind of on top of all of the hours that are spent and all of the focus that is taken. And that's a thing that, that we need to keep in mind. And it's certainly a thing that I try to watch out for, because it's also challenging to understand the impact sometimes, right? And one of the things that we really try to highlight is the actual impact that they probably had. and it's hard to describe that, but when you're monitoring some type of critical infrastructure and you detect an attack early on and you're able to evict the adversary early on, does that mean that you kept power on for an entire city, potentially a military installation, or other deployed military units that are powering defensive capabilities and protecting the general public? Does that mean that you're helping sustain a better state of morale for the general public and certainly for the fighting forces as well? So we try to talk through these things and and relay the impact that these actions are certainly having, but will never be observed, which is how you want your job to run, when you're doing this type of a thing. And so really trying to highlight the wins and the positive impact is a significant thing. And certainly there's a lot of emotional investment kind of on top of this emotional taxation, because we do have personnel in country, right, in harm's way, there to fight the good fight, if you will. And those personnel have had their families kind of torn apart, so to speak, because, certainly for good reason, Ukraine has is not allowing military age males to leave right now. So, families have left and military age males have stayed behind, and gone to fight kinetically, continue to fight electronically. And bearing this all in mind as we hunt is I don't know. I can't even really describe it, right? I just can't. But it's the human side of this is the biggest piece, certainly, and making sure that everybody is as safe as they possibly can be, and is emotionally as well as physically, certainly, is a big deal, and it's a challenge, and something that I think about on a daily basis. How do we make things better? How do we keep people in as high spirits as we can, and maintain a high level of morale? And again, to Ashley's points, we've restructured teams to try and help focus on that. We've restructured teams to try and help reduce burden. We've automated things to reduce burden. So there's a whole lot going into this, from a making the job easier perspective, all the way to kind of the more impactful. What has my impact been, trying to relay that, and giving people the breaks that they need, or even the resources just to talk to somebody, right? If they need to talk to somebody, kind of thing.
Yeah. Thank you for talking about that. I think we've talked about this quite a lot with good reason. And Ashley, you mentioned on the Security Stories podcast a few months ago the difficulty that you had with putting your laptop down at God knows what time of day, and not being in a war zone, and finding it a bit of a struggle to sort of adapt to that reality. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it is strange. I think it's a bit surreal. We have people in region, and those people are very much in harm's way. And so from my perspective, I'm not in harm's way. I'm very much invested in the goings on of the conflict from a cyber perspective, and from a hunting perspective, and from an operational perspective with managing the operations on the Talos side. But when I close my laptop and I walk away from it, I am not in physical danger. I go about my day-to-day life. And that is something, I'm fortunate for that, but it's also something that's very weird. And so, in kind of handling that, those emotions, it is really helpful, I think, to talk to someone. For me, it was a professional, it was actual therapy, but for other people, it may be, a trusted contact or whatever. But, it is a strange thing, I think, in the security world, to deal with such heavy topics, and they are all, digital in the computer in front of you, and they're not necessarily in the real world, and it can be a surreal experience. And so, I, of course, recognize, again, I'm not in physical danger, and I'm certainly not, the one who is, sheltering from bombs in Ukraine. But, if you are a security researcher and you feel that sense of surrealism and you're struggling with it, I would really encourage you to seek someone to talk to.
Yeah, great advice. Ashley, let's stay with you for a little bit. I mentioned I'd like to dig a little deeper about the threat hunting program structure, how you structured it to support our people and the critical infrastructure in Ukraine to the best of our ability. Could you talk about some of the challenges that you've encountered along the way, and how you've overcome those with the threat hunting program?
Yeah, I think the first challenge was volume of data specifically. And so this is a very large deployment across a lot of different endpoints, and that data set is enormous. And so being able to effectively determine how we're going to go about looking through that data, especially when we're looking for, you could say it's a needle in a haystack, but I feel like that's not even enough to describe the issue of data. We're looking for something new that hasn't been seen before, that's indicative of an attack that we know nothing about. And so we're really, stretching our knowledge and our capacity, and really trying to find those things as early as possible. And so, as I mentioned, we do some level of automation, and that's automation in-house on top of the automation that these products do. And those kind of give us a starting point. But I would also say over time, as our hunters became more familiar with the environments that they were looking at, you're kind of able to establish a baseline of what is normal. There's a lot of weird things that happen on people's environments that you would think are indicative of an attack, but are just normal, weird behavior that is typical for that environment. And so as time goes on, our hunters were able to really kind of figure out where that line was and establish that normal. I think also in the beginning, like I said, we had that problem of scale, and over time we've been able to handle that better. And now it's an issue of sustainability, where we're really, looking to continue these efforts as much as possible. And we don't know when there will be an endpoint. It's really hard, I think, to define when things are finished. And so being able to continue these efforts and sustain this program as long as possible mostly centers around making sure that we're managing burnout on the people side. And so as part of that, we're really trying to drive engagement, making sure that our hunters feel rewarded and valued and know that their actions are really directly contributing to this effort. Making sure we're rotating people in and out, making sure that we're offering resources if anyone needs help. It really is something that we're actively trying to do and improve as much as we can throughout this process. And so it's very much a live program that's changing very fluidly.
Yeah. We'll come back to some specific advice that you might have for other organizations implementing threat hunting programs. But this is a question for everyone. And going back to that Ukrainians have put in over the last few years, longer than that actually. What would you say are the specific changes that they made that has had the biggest impact against the Russian aggression on the cybersecurity side? Question for anybody.
I guess I can start. I think, again, kind of as I had alluded to, or not alluded to, as directly said earlier, they've done a good job of learning about their adversary, because the adversary, Russia has been picking on them for so long, and picking on them is probably not the right term to use. It's been more aggressive than that. But I think that from a change perspective, what I have observed since the invasion is more kind of interagency cooperation and information sharing, right? And certainly also the increase in assistance from the rest of the world, right? Whether it be nation state or private company, right? There are a lot of private companies out there that are certainly helping. I can think of so many off the top of my head that are offering free assistive services. So I think, but in terms of what the Ukrainian people themselves have done, I really think it's kind of information sharing, right? And more cooperation between the different agencies involved, and frankly, even between the organizations, the private entities, critical infrastructure, things of that nature, the willingness to work aggressively with the outside organizations, whether it be, their own nation state or whether it be a private organization that's coming in and offering assistive measures.
Yeah. Ashley, I think we have a fellow data fan watching, just seen in the comments. Must be great to kind of compare all the different data sets of all of the different sites. Maybe you could speak a little bit about that in terms of, you mentioned how it's important to find like what is normal. So when you're looking at all of this data from all of these different sites, how are you sorting through what is the most important, finding that what isn't a needle in a haystack, but even more hard to find?
It's an interesting problem. It's a problem, I think, it's good to have too much data. I'd rather have too much than too little. But it also represents challenges, like you said, with finding what is normal. And so there are some ways that you can help yourself do that a little more effectively. We've assigned these organizations to different groups, our small hunting groups. according to the vertical that these customers are in. So if there's any similarities between their function or the type of data that they would see, anything like that. And that really helps our hunting teams when they're looking at similar data sets to be able to establish that normal more easily. I think also, there is some automation that the Cisco product that we're using allows us to use to be able to help establish that norm. There's actually some interesting graphics that go along with that will kind of give you like a heat map, which is a very nice visual. But it takes time and familiarity, I would say. There's no easy way to establish that baseline. And so it really requires an eye that's somewhat knowledgeable about the environment. And I would say from a hunting perspective, there's a lot of, I mentioned weird behavior that may or may not be normal. There's a lot of that in the hunting world. And so really being able to dig and be able to pivot and Google even to figure out, is this behavior that's common? Is it not? What does this program do? I think a lot of threat hunting in general is trial and error and really being able to stretch and try and figure out what is this and what is it doing. At Talos, we're very fortunate to have a plethora of resources that allow us to figure that out. But even at a less resource organization, being able to find things and answer questions like that will really help threat hunting in general. So, too much data is a problem, but it's a good problem to have. And I think that combination of automation and also having really talented hunters that are able to ask those questions and find answers is really beneficial there.
Great. I want to spend maybe the last 10 minutes or so talking about giving an update on what we're seeing threat-wise in the landscape and giving advice for the organizations listening in terms of what they need to be aware of. So we're still seeing a constant barrage of infostealers, credential harvesting efforts. JJ, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about GoMet. We saw that in the timeline. What is that and why is it important?
Yeah. So I guess I'll start by just describing what it is. It's a Trojan/remote access tool written in Go. It's actually base source code is publicly available on GitHub. It has been for some time. Oddly, though, we hadn't seen it used in the wild very much at all, even since its code was published, and until just recently. And what's interesting about it is it is a relatively basic tool, capable of running kind of what you would expect, kind of arbitrary commands as well as predefined set of commands. But it also has this other notion, this capability of being able to daisy chain it. Daisy chaining itself is, I would have, 2 instances, for example, if I were an attacker of GoMet running inside of an environment. One instance would be placed on a machine that has communications to the internet, is able to talk out to the internet. That instance would be the daisy chain kind of pivot point, if you will, right? Or proxy, to use a term that we're probably all more familiar with. And it would then relay communication from another internal, maybe presumed to be more secure host that is typically not allowed to talk to the internet and cannot, in fact, directly talk to the internet. But now it's able to communicate through this other host back to the internet, and whatever sensitive information may exist on it or other sensitive parts of the network that may exist that it can talk to, the adversary now potentially has access to, or can at least start to develop access and gain access into those more sensitive parts of the network. When I think about that, I think about organizations specifically around critical infrastructure where they've got an OT environment that classically can't talk to the internet, right? But it can talk to other certain internal hosts that they use as bastion hosts, for example, or that they forgot they opened up a little hole to be able to talk to a host for troubleshooting, right? We unfortunately commonly see that. But I'm not suggesting that we see that in Ukraine right now, but that's a common thing that we've seen over the years, certainly. I think the important thing, or the other more interesting thing to me is where we found the GoMet activity and kind of where we're continuing to see it. And it's at a software development firm that's not going to be named. But the customer list, of course, is very interesting and would allow, if the appropriate level of access were gained by an adversary, would allow for access, potentially access anyway, to a number of critical customers, providing what I would consider relevant intelligence to a force, even from a kinetic perspective, right? So obviously we have very serious concerns there from a kind of a supply chain targeting perspective. And if I'm being honest, when I look at some of the historic things that have happened in region, it makes perfect sense to me that we're going to start to see targeting such as that, right? I mean, I expect that to happen globally, not just in Ukraine, right? And we've seen more of that over the last several years. You know, going back to even the big solar winds extravaganza, if you will. So I think that we're going to see this type of targeting. I certainly think it's in line with espionage at this point, and trying to gain that intelligence again to help support certainly kinetic efforts, but also continued cyber efforts in region.
And for anyone who wants to read a little bit more about GOMET, we've just put a link to a blog on our social channels. So if you take a view of that, we'll go into a bit more detail about that as well. So last couple of questions. For the defenders out there watching, what are the lessons from Ukraine that can apply to their own environments? Obviously, thankfully, not everyone is facing, a determined nation state attacking them. But the TTPs have many applications. So I was wondering, what are your main recommendations? Ashley, maybe we can start with you on that one.
Yeah, my recommendation, I think, would be from an operational standpoint. One of the reasons that our program has been so successful from a hunting perspective is because we prioritize and optimize our hunters' time so that they are only threat hunting. And specifically, they're only hunting for things that are of critical priority. So, they're not kind of burdened with the day-to-day of, typical alerts, things that are of low impact. They're really trying to find behavior that is indicative of a targeted attack. And so by freeing up their time to really spend it on those difficult problems, we've been able to be successful. And I think many analysts and security teams that are under-resourced find themselves spending most of their time on problems that are of low impact. So if you are in a position where you're running an analyst team or you have a security team that is really burdened by a large number of alerts, then you should probably consider prioritizing their time so that they're able to better use it and really work on the things of high impact to your organization.
Great. Dima, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think everything was already added. And I strongly suggest again to check the Talos blog as we following the situation together with our partners and adding different countermeasures that could be applied to partners and partners' environment and commercial companies in Ukraine. So,
yeah, absolutely. JJ, anything you'd like to talk about from a defender standpoint?
I think I would just kind of echo and reinforce Ashley's statement, right? If you have too much to look at, you're going to get complacent and you're not going to look at it. So, filter it out to the really relevant stuff, potentially even against just the really relevant targets, which means you need to assess or maybe even reassess what the relevant targets are that an adversary may be looking at in your environment. One of the things that we did in our automation was, we're really trying to just flag, for lack of a better phrase, those really damning events, right? Something that has a high rate of true positive, something that when we see it immediately, the hair on the back of my neck stands up and I'm like, oh yeah, that's, unless there's a red teamer doing red teaming things, which there certainly should not be in Ukraine right now. Right then, and it's good to even catch the red teamers, right? You want to catch the red teamers. So, I mean, let's be honest, everybody loves catching the red teamers. But I think that's kind of what it is, and make sure you're taking care of your people, right? Try to really pay attention to any type of signs of burnout, and openly talk about it, right? As a team and in direct one-on-ones, right? Be very open and honest about, you know, what expectations are, and if there's any type of burnout or any type of extra stress that needs to be dealt with, right? You want to deal with that early on, so that it doesn't actually turn into a problem. Is, I guess, kind of, yeah, that's probably all I would add to that.
Yeah, so I have my own version of a red team member at the moment, which is my cat trying to treat my screen as a scratching post. So I am sorry for the gibbering. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. Before we close, Ashley, you wanted to pitch something. Take it away.
Yeah, just before we close, if you are an organization in Ukraine who's interested in having Talos help you secure your organization and to participate in this threat hunting program, please reach out via any of our social channels or email or any other way that you can contact us. We are offering our security products for free. It's really important to us to continue to support Ukraine throughout the duration of the conflict. So as long as this goes on, you know, we're going to run this program, and we would really encourage others to reach out and join.
Perfect. Okay. Well, on that note, I think we'll close. If you have any other questions or anything that you'd like to reach out to the team about, probably sending us a DM on Twitter is one of the fastest way to reach us. Definitely welcome that. And if there's anything else that we can help you with, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine Independence Day. To stay up to date on any threat-related activities, follow the Talos blog, so talosintelligence.com. You'll always have the latest information on there. So with that, thank you very much to JJ, to Dima, and to Ashley. Thank you for watching. Do take care, and we'll see you soon.